People in the Middle Ages didn't have fridges, but they still found smart ways to keep food from going bad. Some of those old tricks still work today, and they're a lot more useful than you'd think. These methods help people survive, and they're not just history. Starting with salt curing, this might be the oldest food preservation trick in human history, and it's still going strong today. Long before refrigerators hummed in our kitchens, people discovered that rubbing meat with salt made it last for months instead of days. The science is simple but brilliant. Salt pulls moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria simply can't survive. No water, no bacterial party. In medieval times, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was liquid gold. People would travel hundreds of miles just to get their hands on this precious mineral. Coastal communities had a massive advantage, setting up salt evaporation ponds along shorelines, while inland folks often paid ridiculous prices for salt carried by merchants. Some medieval salt traders were so wealthy they could buy entire villages, which proves that selling something that makes food not rot was basically the medieval version of inventing Facebook. The value of salt was so immense that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with it. That's where our word salary comes from, derived from salarium. Imagine showing up to work on payday and your boss hands you a bag of salt instead of a check. Good luck paying your rent with that. Every region developed their own salt-curing specialties. In the cold north, salt cod became a staple that could survive the harshest winters. In Mediterranean countries, salt-cured hams like prosciutto developed into an art form, with specialized curing chambers and techniques passed down through generations. These weren't just preservation methods. They were creating entirely new foods with complex flavors that people actually preferred over fresh meat. The most impressive part? Many of these ancient techniques remain virtually unchanged today. When you bite into a piece of prosciutto or beef jerky, you're tasting essentially the same food that medieval people enjoyed. The same natural processes, the same chemical reactions, just without the constant fear of plague and Vikings. Salt curing wasn't just about survival, it changed how people traveled and traded. Ships could now stay at sea for months with preserved foods that wouldn't spoil. Sailors may have had scurvy and missing teeth, but at least they had plenty of salty meat to gum on during those long voyages. And salt was just the beginning of medieval ingenuity when it came to keeping dinner from spoiling. Smoking meat ranks as one of medieval Europe's most brilliant preservation methods, turning ordinary cuts of pork, beef, and fish into long-lasting food that actually tasted better than when it started. Unlike salt, which simply prevented decay, smoke added new flavors while keeping food safe to eat for months. How did it work? The science behind smoking is fascinating. When wood burns slowly, it releases compounds called phenols and formaldehyde, natural preservatives that coat the surface of meat and slow down bacterial growth. These same compounds give smoked meat that distinctive flavor we still crave today. Medieval people didn't know the chemistry, but they definitely knew the results. Two main smoking techniques developed during medieval times. Cold smoking kept meat at temperatures below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, slowly drying it out over days or even weeks. Hot smoking, on the other hand, partially cooked the meat while infusing it with that smoky flavor. Think of it as medieval multitasking. Back then, having smoke-flavored breath was probably considered attractive. "Oh, he smells like smoked ham" wasn't an insult. It was a medieval pickup line. Different regions favored different woods for their unique flavors. Oak and hickory were popular in northern Europe, while fruit woods like apple and cherry were prized in orchard regions. People discovered that the type of wood used would dramatically change the flavor of the final product. A culinary discovery we still appreciate in modern barbecue. Monasteries became unexpected centers for smoked meat production. Many medieval monks specialized in smoking techniques, creating tradable goods that brought income to their communities. Some monasteries built special smoke rooms with hooks hanging from the ceiling where meats could cure for months. These monks weren't just preserving food, they were developing culinary traditions that would last for centuries. The smoking method created some of our most beloved foods. Bacon, ham, kippers, and smoked salmon all trace their origins to medieval smoking techniques. These weren't just preserved foods, they were delicacies. The next time you enjoy a slice of bacon, remember you're basically eating like medieval royalty, just with fewer sword fights at the dinner table. As effective as smoke and salt were, people throughout the Middle Ages continued to develop even more ingenious ways to keep their food edible through long winters and unpredictable harvests. Did medieval people know something we've forgotten? Air drying, perhaps the simplest preservation method of all, worked miracles with nothing more than careful placement and patience. This technique relied on three things that cost absolutely nothing: airflow, sunshine, and low humidity. Medieval households dried almost everything. Herbs hung upside down from rafters, mushrooms strung on threads across windows, fish splayed open in coastal breezes, thin slices of meat turned into portable jerky, and even pasta dried on racks in Italy. The process was simple. Remove moisture, and food would last for months. The biggest challenge? Keeping bugs away. People developed solutions like wrapping foods in cheesecloth or hanging them high in smoke-filled rafters where insects couldn't reach. Many medieval homes had special drying corners that family members protected like modern people guard their Wi-Fi passwords. In drier regions like southern Spain, drying happened outdoors, but in damper northern areas, finding the right indoor spot made all the difference between preserved food and moldy waste. The most impressive thing is how little this technique has changed. Today's dry-cured meats, Spanish jamon, Italian bresaola, use almost exactly the same processes developed in medieval times. The only difference? Medieval people did this out of necessity, while we pay premium prices for these artisanal foods. Air drying teaches us something powerful. Sometimes the most effective solution is also the simplest. No special equipment, no complex chemistry, just working with nature. While air drying worked wonders when conditions were right, medieval people still needed ways to preserve food during challenging seasons. Their next innovative solution involved something abundant in winter, but precious in summer. Before electric freezers existed, medieval people created their own cold storage systems called ice houses. These clever structures allowed communities to keep perishable foods fresh during warm months using ice harvested during winter. It was nature's refrigerator, and it worked surprisingly well. The ice harvesting process began in the dead of winter when lakes and ponds froze solid. Teams would cut large blocks using special saws, then haul them to specially built ice houses where the ice was packed tightly and insulated with layers of straw, sawdust, or sheep's wool. Medieval ice houses were engineering marvels, mostly built partially underground where the earth naturally maintained cooler temperatures. The walls were thick, often made of stone or packed earth, with small entrances to minimize warm air intrusion. The medieval ice delivery man had the coldest job in town, literally. When someone asks what job would give you the chills back then, ice keeper wins hands down. These ice houses could keep their frozen cargo solid for months, sometimes well into autumn, 6 to 8 months after harvest. Persian engineers created even more advanced versions called yakchals, dome-shaped structures that could keep ice frozen throughout the entire summer in desert regions. People stored meats, fish, dairy products, and even some fruits and vegetables in these icy chambers. The colder temperatures significantly slowed bacterial growth, extending the shelf life of foods that would otherwise spoil within days. Medieval kings served ice cream as the ultimate power move. Nothing says, "I'm filthy rich," like eating frozen desserts before electricity existed. While keeping food cold was revolutionary, medieval cooks also discovered that submerging certain foods in tangy liquids created an entirely different kind of preservation magic. Pickling stands as one of the most versatile food preservation methods medieval people mastered. The basic concept was wonderfully straightforward. Soak foods in vinegar or brine, salt water, to create an environment where harmful bacteria simply couldn't survive. What makes pickling so remarkable is how many different foods could be preserved this way, from vegetables and eggs to fish and even meats. The science works because most spoilage bacteria can't thrive in highly acidic environments. Vinegar, with its acetic acid content, creates exactly this kind of hostile bacterial environment. Similarly, heavily salted brine solutions draw moisture out of both food and any bacteria trying to grow on it. These simple chemical principles allowed medieval households to store seasonal foods for months beyond their natural shelf life. In medieval Europe, nearly every region developed its own pickling traditions. German communities created sauerkraut by fermenting cabbage in its own juices with salt. Mediterranean cultures preserved olives in brine. English households pickled onions, eggs, and walnuts in spiced vinegar. Nordic countries perfected methods for pickling herring that remain popular today. Medieval sailors carried barrels of pickled vegetables on long voyages, not just for preservation, but because they helped prevent scurvy. Imagine being the first sailor to discover that eating strange-smelling cabbage from a barrel kept your teeth from falling out. Talk about a hard sell to your crewmates. Pickling wasn't just practical, it transformed foods in delicious ways. Many pickled items were considered delicacies rather than merely preserved necessities. Royal courts across Europe served pickled fruits and vegetables as status symbols, often importing exotic ingredients specifically for pickling. The Tower of London even had dedicated pickling kitchens where royal cooks prepared special preserves for the king's table. Pickling containers evolved over time. Early medieval picklers used wooden barrels and ceramic crocks. By the late Middle Ages, glass containers became more common among wealthy households. The containers needed to be non-reactive, avoiding metals like copper or iron to prevent chemical reactions with the acidic pickling solutions. What's most impressive is how little pickling techniques have changed over the centuries. The pickled cucumbers, kimchi, and sauerkraut we enjoy today follow almost identical principles to those medieval picklers developed through trial and error. When you open a jar of pickles from your fridge, you're basically performing a food ritual that would be completely familiar to someone from the 1200s, minus the refrigerator, plastic jar, and electricity, of course. While pickling mastered the art of preservation through acidity, medieval cooks discovered another microbial magic trick that didn't just preserve food, it transformed it in unexpected and beneficial ways. Many people today think fermentation is the same as rotting, but medieval folks knew better. Fermentation isn't about food going bad. It's a controlled transformation that creates something entirely new and often better than what you started with. This preservation technique harnessed the power of good bacteria to fight off the bad ones, turning ordinary foods into long-lasting nutritional powerhouses. Rotting is what happens when you forget about that container in the back of your fridge for 6 months. Fermentation is what happens when you deliberately create the perfect conditions for beneficial microbes to thrive. Medieval people might not have known about bacteria by name, but they understood the process remarkably well. How did it work? Take sauerkraut as an example. Cabbage was finely shredded, mixed with salt, then packed tightly into containers to remove oxygen. The salt drew out moisture from the cabbage, creating a natural brine where good bacteria thrived while harmful ones couldn't survive. These good bacteria produced lactic acid, which both preserved the food and gave it that distinctive tangy flavor. Medieval people fermented milk into yogurt and cheese, fruit juices into wine, and grains into beer and bread. Each fermented food had its own community of beneficial microbes doing the preservation work. Fermented drinks played a particularly important role in medieval life. Water quality was often questionable, but the fermentation process killed harmful pathogens. Medieval children drank weak beer for breakfast, which probably explains why history class always depicts them looking like tiny adults with serious expressions. Different environments naturally developed different fermentation traditions. In colder northern climates, fermented cabbage and root vegetables helped communities survive long winters. In warmer regions, milk quickly spoiled without refrigeration, so yogurt and cheese became dietary staples. While fermentation worked wonders for food preservation, medieval people discovered another preservation approach that added flavor and medicinal benefits. Alcohol wasn't just for drinking in medieval times. It was a powerful food preservation tool that could make fruits, herbs, and other perishables last for months or even years. From the 1100s to the 1300s, monasteries and noble households perfected the art of using wine, ale, and spirits to preserve everything from cherries to medicinal herbs. The basic principle behind alcoholic preservation is deceptively simple. Alcohol kills most bacteria that cause food to spoil. Medieval people understood this connection even if they didn't understand the microscopic reasons why it worked. They noticed that food submerged in wine or strong spirits lasted much longer than those left in the open air. Fruit preserves were among the most popular alcohol-preserved foods. Cherries, plums, and berries would be packed into jars or barrels, then covered with wine or brandy. Herbs were steeped in alcohol to create tinctures and tonics that maintained their healing properties longer than dried herbs alone. Low alcohol beverages like ale and mead weren't just for getting medieval people through their day-to-day hardships. They were safer to drink than water from the local well. When the choice is between drinking slightly alcoholic beer or playing diarrhea roulette with the town water supply, it's not hard to see why medieval children grew up with a taste for ale. As distillation techniques improved in the later Middle Ages, high-proof spirits became available and dramatically improved preservation capabilities. Medieval celebrations often featured special preserved treats that had been stored since the previous harvest season. Fruitcakes soaked in brandy were holiday favorites across Europe. These dense, alcohol-soaked cakes could last for years, which might explain why that fruitcake your aunt gives you every Christmas seems so indestructible. It's not just a dessert, it's practically medieval technology. While alcoholic preservation excelled at keeping certain foods viable above ground, medieval people also developed ingenious ways to use the earth itself as a natural refrigerator. Root cellars and underground storage spaces were the medieval version of refrigerators, using the Earth's natural cooling and insulating properties to keep food fresh. These clever underground rooms maintained a steady temperature year-round, cool in summer and insulated from freezing in winter, creating the perfect environment for storing everything from vegetables to wine. The Earth maintains a remarkably constant temperature about 8 feet below the surface, typically between 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the weather above ground. Medieval people used this natural phenomenon to their advantage, creating rooms partially or completely underground for natural refrigeration. In rocky regions, root cellars might be carved directly into hillsides or built into existing caves. In flatter areas, they were dug into the ground and reinforced with wooden beams, stone, or brick walls. Most designs included a small entrance facing north to reduce sun exposure and sometimes featured air vents to control humidity. Medieval root cellars were basically underground food apartments. The rent was cheap, the temperature control was excellent, but the neighbors were usually rats and the occasional toad. Root cellars stored more than just root vegetables. Apples, pears, cabbage, onions, and even eggs could last for months in these cool chambers. Wine and cider benefited greatly from the constant cool temperatures, developing better flavors over time. Different foods required different storage conditions. Some needed high humidity, others needed drier air. Carrots might be buried in sandy soil to prevent drying out, while onions were hung from rafters to keep dry. A well-built root cellar could mean the difference between starving in late winter and having enough food to last until spring. Underground food storage was so effective that many homesteaders, preppers, and off-grid enthusiasts still build root cellars today. It's probably the only medieval technology that doomsday preppers and organic farmers can agree is absolutely brilliant. The beauty of underground storage was how it worked with nature rather than against it. But for some foods, even the cool conditions of a root cellar weren't enough. For these, medieval people turned to another remarkable preservation technique that transformed one of the most perishable foods into something that could last for months or even years. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in medieval times, but turning it into cheese extended its shelf life by months or even years. This transformation wasn't just practical, it created entirely new foods with complex flavors that became dietary staples throughout Europe. Without refrigeration, cheese-making wasn't just a culinary choice, it was essential food security. The medieval cheese-making process began with fresh milk, usually from cows, sheep, or goats. Rennet, an enzyme from calf stomachs, was the miracle worker here. When added to warm milk, rennet caused the proteins to clump together, forming solid curds in a matter of hours. Once the curds formed, they would be cut, drained, and sometimes pressed to remove excess whey. Salt was added both for flavor and preservation, as it helped draw out moisture and prevent harmful bacteria from growing. Making cheese was a bit like medieval alchemy, except instead of turning lead into gold, you turned liquid that goes bad in a day into solids that last for years. Plus, you could eat the results, which is more than you can say for most alchemy experiments. Aging was where true cheese magic happened. Young cheeses were placed in cool environments, often natural caves or specially built cheese cellars, where they would slowly transform as they aged. During this time, beneficial molds and bacteria worked on the cheese, developing complex flavors. The most impressive medieval cheeses were the hard, aged varieties that required months or even years of careful attention. Parmesan-style cheeses originated during this era, with some wheels weighing up to 80 pounds and aging for 2 years or more. Medieval cheese caves provided the perfect environment for long aging, cool, humid, and naturally insulated. They were essentially cheese spas where wheels could relax and mature at their own pace, much like modern retirement communities, but for dairy products. What's most remarkable is how many of these ancient cheese-making techniques remain virtually unchanged today. The artisanal cheese movement is essentially rediscovering methods that medieval cheesemakers would instantly recognize. While turning milk into long-lasting cheese was ingenious, medieval people developed yet another preservation technique that created an almost impenetrable barrier between food and the outside world. Hot wax and animal fat served as medieval food preservers by creating airtight seals that kept food fresh for months. These simple but effective methods prevented exposure to air, the main culprit behind food spoilage. Wax sealing and fat packing were among the final lines of defense in the medieval preservation arsenal, often used after foods had already been processed using other techniques. Let's start with wax sealing. Beeswax was the most common material, harvested from beehives and melted down to create a liquid that would harden into a solid protective coating. Medieval cooks would pour thin layers of melted wax over the surface of jams, jellies, and preserves to create an airtight seal. Once the wax hardened, it formed a barrier that prevented mold and bacteria from reaching the food underneath. Wax wasn't just for sweet preserves. Hard cheeses were often dipped entirely in wax, creating a protective shell that allowed them to age properly while preventing unwanted mold growth. Some cheeses, like Gouda, are still traditionally coated in wax today. Wax sealing was basically like giving your food its own personal bodyguard. Sorry, Mr. Bacteria, you're not on the guest list. No spoilage allowed past this waxy barrier. Fat packing worked on similar principles, but used animal fats instead of wax. One of the most famous examples is confit, a technique where meat, typically duck, goose, or pork, was slow cooked in its own fat, then stored completely submerged in that same fat. The layer of fat hardened at cool temperatures, creating a seal that kept air away from the meat. The preservation magic happened because fat creates an oxygen-free environment, and bacteria need oxygen to grow. Meats preserved this way could last for months, sometimes even years, and developed unique flavors and textures that were considered delicacies. Food-grade wax and fat sealing were essentially the medieval version of vacuum sealing. It's like they invented Tupperware 1,000 years early, just without the search for matching lids that mysteriously disappear. These 10 medieval preservation methods remind us that sometimes the old ways are still worth knowing. In our world of refrigeration and mass-produced food, it's easy to forget that humans kept food safe and delicious for centuries, using nothing but careful observation and natural materials.